Welcome back to the Bible in Context.
Where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yeah, and I think we're going to finish Genesis today.
That's the game plan.
Let's see.
Where did we leave off last time?
Yeah, so we finished up with the blessings that Jacob gave to his sons, his last testament, actually. They're not exactly all blessings. We talked about how to interpret those, the significance of some of the major ones. And so now we're moving into Jacob's death and then his burial and then Joseph's death after this. And so we'll talk about really the ending of the book of Genesis and how that flows into Exodus. And then next week we're going to have some just general reflections on our walk through Genesis. Talk about some of the technical aspects, some of the motifs we've seen, and also just some pastoral reflections as well as we go through this. Because we've covered a lot of technical stuff. We can't talk about everything, but hopefully this becomes something that's fruitful for those listening, just applying this to your lives, or if you're a preacher, being able to preach it, and so on.
Yeah, so we're picking back up at the end of chapter 49, starting in verse 28. And what's significant about Jacob's death and burial?
Yeah, so at this point, after he's given his blessings, he makes the sons promise that they will take him back to Canaan and bury him there, rather than burying him in Egypt, because he is leaning on God's promise to make that land their possession. He wants to be back in the land of his fathers, the land that has been promised to Abraham, that is part of this goal of Yahweh making them a light to the nations. And so really this is a final act of faith on Jacob's part, I think. So this final moment of Jacob is just a testament to his trust in Yahweh, his final ending faith in Yahweh. So he ends on a good high note, and I think that's reinforced by the fact that we're told he's going to the same field that Abraham has purchased, which is already partially a possession for Israel, and he's going to Mamre. And remember, if you go back to the Genesis 22 episode, we talk about how there's these MMR words that show up as locations throughout Genesis. You got Mamre, More, Moriah, these kind of alliterated names that have very Edenic connotations to them, very high, blessed connotations behind them. So I think that really puts Jacob as ending on a very high place. Not to mention that the statement in verse 30 just goes on to recount that whole scene between Abraham and Ephron the Hittite.
Right, so it takes us all the way back there. And what was the significance of that land originally? I mean...
Yeah, so in chapter 23, this is where Abraham is getting a burial place for Sarah. And so by purchasing this land, this becomes the first bit of land that Abraham owns. I mean, this whole land is supposed to be what Yahweh gives to Abraham, but now Abraham finally has a piece of it. This is sort of a first fruits of the promise.
Right.
Sprinkled throughout Genesis, just speaking about reflections, I mean, we have these little seeds of people being given just little tastes of the future promises of God throughout Genesis. So there's just little reminders all the way through.
Right. And is there, like, with this land, this first fruits, like you said, I like how you put that, are there any echoes of Eden and Mamre? Or
Yeah. So we won't get too far into that right now. Again, go back to listen to the Genesis 22 episode where we talk about that a little more in depth. But there's definitely some things that at least remind us of Eden and are supposed to literally draw us back there and make us think of God's dwelling place.
Right. And I just think there's some significance with the fact that we started in Eden and we're ending Genesis back there with Jacob wanting to...
Well, right. And remember a few episodes ago, we talked about how the family is given a possession in Goshen where they have an abundance of food and they're being fruitful and multiplied. And so...
Echoes of Eden there too.
Right. And so we end on that very high note as well.
Right.
So again, first fruits of the promises all throughout until God finally does it. So after this final statement of faith, Jacob dies. And so Joseph mourns for his father. He's highlighted here. Again, he's been kind of our main character throughout this story as our messianic figure and favored son. It takes 40 days to embalm Jacob to prepare him for his journey back to the promised land. And I think that 40 is significant. Again, I think it's going to remind us of the 40 years that Israel spent in the wilderness, this kind of journey from Egypt into Israel. So once again, we're highlighting that Exodus pattern, that Exodus motif here. We're going to see some more echoes of that as well, but that's kind of where it starts out. It could also be pointing to the 400 years that Israel spent in Egypt because he's in Egypt being embalmed, kind of, waiting there in death, waiting for new creation, new life in a sense, as Israel was. But I think it probably makes sense to relate the 40 days to the 40 years spent in the wilderness. Just some possibilities there. But either way, I think we're kind of kicking off this train of thought that is supposed to bring us to the Exodus.
Yeah,
So
setting up a pattern.
yeah. And so they wept for 70 days. Again, 70 shows up, just again, I think honoring Jacob here. So after that, Joseph, he requests of Pharaoh, he says, let me go up to bury his father. And that's very similar to Moses's, send me away so that we may go and worship Yahweh. So they both make these requests of Pharaoh for them to leave Egypt and go to Joseph, go to Canaan, and Moses go to worship Yahweh. So once again, ties to the Exodus. And it's kind of interesting that it says in verse 8 that they're going to leave their children, their flocks, and their herds. Whereas in Exodus 10:24, Pharaoh says, okay, Moses, you can go, but leave your flocks and your herds and your children, all those things, so that you will be sure to return. Here, Joseph does leave those things with the intent to return, which he says explicitly in verse 5. And so, again, I just think another echo of what will happen in the Exodus between Moses and Pharaoh.
Right. Well, and I want going back to what you said about just that little phrase, asking him to go up to Canaan. And I wonder if we're meant to be reminded that they went down to Egypt.
Yeah, there's been that death motif with Egypt where they go down to it. And like Michael Morales points out, like not geographically down, but this whole story has been about going down to Sheol, down to the pit, down to Egypt.
Yeah. And so now he's going to get buried. He's actually he's died, but he's going to take him up to Canaan, which that's interesting.
Yeah, up to God's space, metaphorically here.
Right,
so
right.
That's good. And so verses 7 through 9, they go up as a mixed multitude. They don't have great possessions. They leave those behind intentionally in this one. But again, we have that mixed multitude part of the Exodus motif happening here. They all mourn again for 7 days before crossing the Jordan, going into the land. Again, I think honoring and heightening Jacob here. And here in verse 12, we see that the sons, they are united together and they are loyal to their father in this final moment. So again, this is just... we're ending the story well. This is a good way to end the Genesis story.
Yeah, and this also recalls just how Jacob and Esau came back together at the death of their father. Yeah,
right. Yeah. So another pattern there.
Yeah, when there's a death, and that's true in our own lives too. I mean, death does bring families together, right?
Yeah, and it wraps up each of these. I like to think narratively, you're right. But yeah, like it wraps up these sections very nicely as a nice story each time.
Has a bow.
Right. I probably get off on too many narrative tangents, thinking literarily, whereas you're like, oh, this is, I don't know, thinking about it humanly. And so, they're here filling Jacob's last request, being faithful to him in his last statement of hope in Yahweh's future promises. We're reminded again of the Edenic setting, as we're reminded about the field of Machpelah, the tree-filled field where Sarah is buried. We're reminded that this place is called Mamre. So we have again these Edenic connotations going on. We're reminded of the significance of the story in chapter 23, where Abraham bought the field from Ephron the Hittite. That's mentioned again, just again to transport us back to that significant story and to transport us back to the Edenic connotations which surround these places. So Jacob, he has ended on a very high note. He has expressed hope in Yahweh's future promises in his last moments. His sons have unified in being faithful to him in his burial. And so they return back to Egypt, and we get one more little hiccup in the story before things resolve and close out.
Right. And I think this shows that like they've seen forgiveness, they've seen reconciliation, but their past still is going to impact them. And so their father dies, and now they're anxious.
Right.
They're nervous that Joseph is, like now Joseph's going to pay us back.
Yeah, he left us alive earlier for the sake of our father, but now that he's gone, there's no reason to keep us alive. He can get his revenge.
Right.
And so they concoct this lie here in verses 16 and 17, saying that Jacob's final wish was for Joseph to forgive his brothers, which we're, again, not told that. And again, if we're reading this for historical purposes, well, maybe it was said, but it wasn't written down earlier. But I think, again, we're reading this as a narrative, as a story. If the author wanted us to think that happened, he would have told us, because he's doing things and saying things to heighten and resolve tensions, right? So it's intentional. So again, they lie one more time. And it says that Joseph wept in verse 17 when they spoke this to him, because our messianic figure who has tested and proven his brothers, who has worked for reconciliation, who works for the preserving of a remnant of the family, He's done all this, and they still don't trust him. They still don't trust our messianic figure. They don't get it. And so Joseph says in verse 19, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" He's saying, I'm not judge over you. God is. Then he says the famous quote in verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." And thus he comforted and spoke kindly to them. So he expresses his heart of forgiveness. He comforts them, which we're going to come back to that word in a second. He says that he's not the judge over them. It's God, but actually God has used all of this circumstance for the salvation of people's lives and for the preserving of a remnant of the elect family who are going to be the light to the nations. Again, just like what Israel is expecting as they're reading this in Babylon or back out of the exile.
Yeah.
That preserved remnant. So this is significant for them.
Well, and you see again Joseph's theology here and his just his faith, and I think he's learned through all the testing that he's been through.
Right.
And he's come to this point where he's completely willing to forgive his brothers and offer them grace and comfort them and remind them that, look, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. I mean, what a solid theology he's come into.
Yeah. It's all in God's hands. He's been using it the whole time. So this does bring us to the question, though, that I think most people ask. Did God cause Joseph's brothers to sin?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I think you go to other places in the scripture and you can make a pretty strong argument that, no, God doesn't force our hand to sin, but he uses our sins. I mean, I was talking about this with my son earlier this week about how, God's going to use broken people because that's all he's got to work with.
Right. Well, that's a really good way to think about it. Because, we see the statement that God meant what you meant for good. And so obviously it means that God intended them to throw Joseph in the pit and to do, what he did. That entire scenario has been preordained from the foundation of the earth.
Right.
We'll talk about that when we get into Ephesians.
Yeah.
But I think we've at least made clear enough our thoughts on how God interacts with us. I think what we can say here is that the brothers intended to do this for selfish gain, and then God took that scenario. He took the wild and waste, the chaos, the formless and void of that scenario, and turned it into something good. Just like he does all throughout Genesis, all through these Exodus motifs, all throughout the Bible, he takes the bad and turns it to good. So if, theoretically, the brothers didn't throw him into this pit, they didn't betray him and sell him, I think God would have fulfilled Joseph's dreams and preserved the world through Joseph, raised him up to be the savior of the world through another means. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's fine that, the Bible in other places attributes what happens to God. And so I was reading in Psalm 105 earlier yesterday, and there's a portion where it recalls what happens with Joseph. I'm going to pick up in verse 16 where it says, when he, God, summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters, and his neck was put in a collar of iron until what he had said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him, and the king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. And so I just think that passage once again shows us that God is a very dynamic God that works with us and in spite of our sins to accomplish whatever he needs to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that, he would have done this regardless of what the brothers did. He took their sin and used it for something rather than forcing the brothers. So God would have tested Joseph through another means if this didn't happen. So I don't think we should read this as God predestining, forcing sin, authoring sin, however you want to put that. I don't think that have we really talked about predestination much on this podcast?
No, but we'll hit hard on that when we get to Ephesians.
Okay. Well, and we've talked about it a little bit with, I think, Aaron Sherwood in some ways. We went over Romans 9 and
right. That's true. True.
So we talked about it a little bit, how we see predestination, how the Old Testament sees predestination, or doesn't see predestination. if you want to know what we think, I guess, go listen to our interview with Aaron Sherwood.
Yeah.
And that'll bring, he brings an Old Testament lens to Romans 9. And so that'll kind of give some nuance, as well as some of our episodes on testing and how that works. We haven't really done a full just thing on predestination or all those things.
Yeah, when we get to Ephesians 1, we'll definitely tackle that, though.
Yeah. So anyway, all that to say is God didn't force the brothers. He worked with the mess that they made.
Yes.
So they had one intention, but God had another intention. Okay, so in his statement, again, Joseph comforted his brothers. Remember that Naham, that's the same root that Noah's name is built off of. God also Nahamed Adam by placing him in the garden.
Rest.
So we're back to that hope of rest, of comfort that was supposed to come through Noah that God had given to Adam originally. I think here that word is probably used to give us a little seed form of that hope of comfort, of resting. The Messiah figure has given Naham, he has Nahamed the elect family.
Right.
Once again. So,
right.
So I think that's probably, again, just another little seed, a little foretaste of the promises of Yahweh that we're getting to see here. So I think that happens throughout just to remind us of the consistency of those promises being expected and in small forms realized, because God continuously cares for his people. It's not just, hey, I'll promise you this, I'll see you in, however long it's going to take for Jesus to return. I'll see you then. I'm not going to interact with humans at all until then.
Right.
I don't think that's the story. So,
right.
And with that, again, the family's reconciled. There's no obstacles to cause the family to fall apart, at least for the moment. And so we're ending in a very good place with the family. The elect family, they have a taste of the possession, the fruitfulness, and the multiplication, and they're all unified. And so now we get to the end of our main character's life in this scene, Joseph. It's time for him to die now at the age of 110, which doesn't seem as long as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he is thoroughly Egyptian in this story, or he's been in Egypt a long time. He's second in command in Egypt. And so it's interesting that 110 is used, because in Egyptian stories, 110 is often an age of an ideal long life of righteousness. So this age is just signaling in Egyptian terms that Joseph is an ideal righteous character who is living a long and blessed life, just like Jacob and Abraham and Isaac and so on. And he sees his children to the third generation, again, reinforcing that blessedness.
Yeah, it's interesting that says it was counted as Joseph's own, which the Hebrew literally means we're born on Joseph's knees. That's interesting.
And he seems to be following in his father's footsteps in that he's adopting his grandsons into his own family. So he's just copying Jacob again. I think, again, this kind of is by mimicking Jacob's final days here. Jacob, he was the firstborn within his family and the patriarch of Israel. And now Joseph, his family through Ephraim, is going to be kind of the firstborn of Israel within this generation.
Right.
And so I think it's, again, just heightening Joseph's place here, finishing our story just as good as Jacob, who is our patriarch of Israel. I think in narrative terms, they are both worthy of these heightened resolutions to their story.
Yeah.
I think that's what's going on.
So what's your thoughts about Joseph's last request before he dies?
Yeah, so he also requests that his bones be taken back up to Canaan. He says that God is going to visit you. And so with him, he doesn't say, hey, take me up. I'm going to die this week. Next week, take me back, just like Jacob does. He says, God's going to visit you. When that happens, bring me back. And so here we have Joseph not just quickly abandoning Egypt and going back to Canaan like Jacob did, but we have his eyes focused on the future promises of Yahweh. And this is setting us up for the book of Exodus, where it's not just, okay, let's wrap up everything in Genesis and make Genesis its own contained unit. There's continuity in the story throughout the Torah, and I think possibly even throughout the Torah and prophets. Conversation for another time.
Yeah, well, you definitely see the end of Genesis setting up Exodus. I mean, you've got these questions like, oh, well, they're not in the promised land. How are they going to get back to the promised land? What's that?
Right.
What's going on with that?
Right. And so now we're ending Genesis. The last paragraph keeps us focused on that coming promise from Yahweh, that we're going to be in Egypt for a long time, but God is going to bring not just Jacob up, but all of us up. And so, bring the bones of this generation's messianic figure with you.
Right.
So, he again, his last statement, Joseph has continued on this high note, on this righteous note, and he ends it again with a statement of hope in Yahweh's promises that also focuses the reader on that same thing.
Right. And we see the beginning of Exodus starting off with, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And so there's this continuity that we're meant to see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, verse 26 ends Genesis with this nice, neat bow. Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him. He was put in a coffin. The end. So we're reminded of that righteous age. And then, like you said, Exodus picks up with, and these are the sons of blah, blah, blah. And it goes on with a new genealogy, opening up a new narrative section that presumes continuity with the previous narrative in Genesis. So at this point, we'll say, if you want more stuff on Exodus, go watch Torah Tuesday. And
well, actually, listen back here in a couple
that's
weeks.
True. Yeah, we're going to plug Torah Tuesday, but we're going to talk to Carmen Imes, and she's going to give us a broad overview of Exodus. So check that out. Yeah, stick around for that. And then, next week we're going to give some reflections on the book of Genesis. We'll have Carmen Imes on, like we just said. And then after that, we'll move on to our discussion about the biblical canon.
Sounds good.